Recording in progress.
Able to make it this. I will say actually, so that question from the survey was a really great way to start this presentation for a number of reasons. And one is because I can't tell you how many young people who I see in my practice who would be blown away by that statistic, that actually the vast majority of teenagers, 13 to 19, I'm assuming is that range, choose not to do this, because it seems like for the people who make it to me, like everybody's doing it, because that's what their social ecosystem looks like. That's what they surround themselves with. That's what they're immersed in. And so they think that it's true, and that you can't necessarily have a vibrant social life. You can't get engaged otherwise. But in that idea that we see what's in front of us and not necessarily the whole picture is a really good theme for our presentation tonight. Because I have noticed really where my passion comes from. I'm an addiction psychologist and I work clinically, but my passion is in education, because what I've found is that unlike every other type of behavioral health condition that I treat, like depression and anxiety, trauma, anything, people are literally out there selling addiction. And part of how they sell addiction is by making it seem like it's not such a big deal, or make their products seem like they're not such a big deal, sowing misinformation. We hear a lot about health misinformation these days. It's a huge problem, and it's not just on the COVID side, it's also on the addiction side and on the addiction for profit side. And so what I like to try to do is close that gap between what you might hear on social media, sometimes even from politicians, from the media itself, and what's being published in medical and psychological journals. Because I think that it's very important for that information to get out so that people can make the best decisions they can for their work, for their kids, for themselves. If you don't have the tools you need to make the best decision, you're walking around blind. So my hope for everybody today is that you learn something that you haven't heard before. And I do try to keep my presentations reasonably updated. And so hopefully if you've heard me speak before, you'll see some newer things tonight. But then also that you feel like you can go do something with this information, because I think that learning is great, but doing is better. And whether or not that's something on the parenting side, and we will end today with some strategies for how to build connections with your children and notice if there's problems going on. We'll definitely talk about that. But being able to actually utilize information is the most important part. If you have questions today that I don't have a chance to address, please reach out to me. My email is here on the first slide. It'll also be on the last one. I'm at aaron@weinerphd.com, and I'd really encourage you to don't be a stranger. I will absolutely write you back. I don't bite. I promise. I'm pretty friendly. So if you have any questions or you'd like any of the sources that we talk about tonight, I'm happy to provide those. So let's first just start, before we get into the nitty gritty, with a more 30,000 foot view, which is that the landscape around marijuana and then how it relates to mental health is changing. And what I mean by that is that if you go back and think about what we used to think about with marijuana, you'd think about things like joints and blunts, which are wrapped in tobacco paper, or bongs where the smoke gets filtered up through water. That's what it used to be, but things are changing now. And what we're starting to see is this increase in concentrate use, which used to require a device like this, basically a modified bong, where you use something called a nail, and you put the concentrate, which is that orange down there in the bottom there, which is a very highly potent concentrated THC down there, and then you use a butane torch to light it. Really cumbersome. Wasn't too easy to use. But now you can put it in vape devices. And this has led to a massive change in terms of what is being bought, and particularly what is being used by young people. Because vaping right now is very much in, which also is not an accident. There's a reason why vaping's caught on. There's a reason why it's become so popular, and it's because the e-cigarette industry, the nicotine industry, has really put their thumb on the scale and has made a point of making this trendy. But the problem is that this delivery system, this way of delivering THC into the body is the most harmful, because it allows a pathway for these incredibly potent concentrates, these incredibly potent substances, to be delivered incredibly easily. You can even look up online, literally just type how to put THC in a joule, and it'll tell you how to do that. There's ways to all sorts of ways to do this, even using like a cutoff USB cable that you use the ends of it to heat up. So it's never been more accessible. And these highly potent products are the ones that are associated with the most harm. And along this route, we're not going to go too deep into this today, but now it's even being adapted into things like THCO acetate, which actually is derived from cannabidiol, but is 3 times as strong as THC, the normal stuff. And you could actually buy this sort of thing from gas stations because, again, it comes from hemp, it comes from CBD, even though it is psychoactive and it's made in this really intense chemical process. So there's been all these changes in terms of how THC is delivered from smoking and vaping, and then edibles have changed right along with it. And I know a lot of times when people look at the edibles that are being sold, you think like, oh, like this is being taken from some of those those initial more unregulated markets like you might find, say, in Colorado or California. These are all pictures I took from dispensary websites here in Illinois. We have pot lollipops, we have the gummies, we have the candies, we have the drinks. And one of these, the undercurrents throughout a lot of what we're looking at is this question of, well, who's really being marketed to? And I guess you might have some plausible deniability that pot lollipops aren't meant to appeal just to kids. Like, I guess a 52-year-old might want a pot lollipop too. But I mean, just think about it hard enough, squint, and I think it's pretty clear what's really going on here. Now, as we've been getting these changes in product, we've also been seeing changes in potency. And I feel like this is a secret that's pretty well out in the open now, but I'm not sure if everyone knows how dramatic it's been. The potency of THC products up until the mid-90s was 3 to 4%. That's down here in the bottom left of the graph, the blue line. And it's been there since was there since the 60s and 70s. But then as the market started picking up and they started doing more selective breeding and genetic modification, things like that, they started breeding out the cannabidiol, that's the CBD, and then enhancing the THC to the point now where virtually everything that you can buy is over 15% THC, which is a lot compared to the 3 to 4%. And actually, this study where these graphs came from, and every part of the pie graph that's green is the over 15% portion. What they found was that states that just had medical programs had an average of 19.2% potency, and recreational had 21.5%. And so what that means is that the average joint of today's marijuana is like literally lighting up 7 from Woodstock and smoking them all at the same time, 3 to 21. That's the implications of that in terms of addictive potential, in terms of mental health concerns, brain changes that we'll talk about for adolescents whose brains are not fully done forming yet, is very significant, because a lot of these problems come from the more THC that you're putting into your body. And the concentrates that I had on the previous slide, those can easily go up over 90%, 92, 95. I think the average for those these days is like 75 or 78% THC, somewhere in that vicinity. Now, the biggest coup of all of this, it was incredibly it's amazing marketing that's been done. If we're just looking at it from a marketing perspective, is that as these products have been getting more and more potent, the perception of risk has been going down and down and down. Actually, right around the same time, if you look there at the early 90s, as the industry started gaining speed, they've been messaging and messaging and messaging about how, well, isn't it medicine? Or there's been this huge push to associate cannabis with wellness. There's also been this huge push to substitute the word cannabis in for marijuana, in part because, and I've got this on a later slide as well, marijuana is associated more with hippie culture, stoner culture, which is a little bit narrower from like a demographic that the industry is trying to recruit and attract. But it also creates, again, this misinformation and cloudiness in data, because cannabis is actually an umbrella term for several different plants, one of which is hemp, which tends to have, has to have very low THC and very high CBD, and then marijuana, which is the name we have for the cannabis plant that has very high THC and almost no CBD. So it creates this web essentially that's difficult to understand. If you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't know what's what, you just hear cannabis, and a lot of kids these days, they're growing up in an era where they're hearing cannabis health product, and that's what they're hearing, even though marijuana very much is not that. The result of this, though, is that it lowers perceived risk. And this is really important when it comes to use rates for kids. This is data looking at the chances that a teenager, or 12 to 17 rather, will either binge drink there on the left or smoke marijuana on the right, even once per week, if they perceive there to be a great risk or any other risk level. And for binge drinking, you can see there that the risk it goes up by two. They are 2 times as likely to binge drink if they don't think it's a great risk. And for marijuana, it's even more extreme, 15 times greater chance that someone's going to use marijuana if they don't think it's a great risk. And this, if you were in the business of addiction for profit, if you were selling drugs or alcohol for that matter, which is a drug, for profit, it behooves you from a business perspective to make that risk seem as low as possible, because the more people who think it's not risky, the more people who are going to use the substance. And that's what we're seeing when we look at kids. The areas of use that are going up most consistently are these big chunks of red. This is the vaping, nicotine and marijuana, and then there's a little bit in the marijuana side as well. This is past use marijuana, past month use and frequent past month use. So 2 out of 3 days or more. And the difference between 2018 and 2019, and it was really going up very significantly. Now, the reason why I'm not putting 2020 data up here is because I'm happy to say that the use rates did not continue to go up. However, I think that's an artifact of the lockdowns. I think that's because everything changed in 2020. Kids had a much harder time getting away from their parents. What we know right now is that youth mental health has never been worse. There's actually been advisories put out by the Surgeon General, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Children's Hospital Association, saying there's an emergency in youth mental health. Actually, the Surgeon General just said it again in front of Congress about 4 or 5 days ago. I wish it was getting more press. But one of the things we know is the most common reason why people use marijuana is to cope with emotional difficulties. And so I think that as we start to look at 2021 data, but definitely the data from this year, 2022 data, which we probably won't have for quite some time, we are going to see the same sort of shift. I pretty much guarantee you that we've seen, say, for example, in opioid overdoses, where you saw those jump up by a tremendous amount already. It would buck all the things we know about how mental health and addiction are related for it not to do that. So this is still very much an area of concern. And here in Illinois, it's very much still an area of concern because we are a state that has recreational commercialized marijuana dispensaries. And what we know about how this has worked in other places is that when we message out to children that this is fine, this is how people have fun, that it's a recreational thing to do, is that they take that in and it affects their behavior. This study was looking at California specifically, at pre and post recreational marijuana laws for adolescents in a few different demographic breakdowns, which is what the graphs are about. But you can see on each one, the slope of that line changes significantly, either goes up or stops going down right after that policy goes into place. And this study just came out last year, looking at our 2 non-contiguous states, Alaska and Hawaii, where Alaska initiated a recreational marijuana program and Hawaii did not, and looking at the changes in their youth use rates. And again, it's really clear when you look at the trends, what this change does in terms of kids. And it doesn't just apply to kids. I think sometimes like when kids turn 18, it's like we don't talk about them as much anymore, but your brain actually isn't done developing until you're at least 25, sometimes 26, 27, 28, depending on the study you look at. And we know that when you legalize, actually the biggest demographic increase in marijuana use rate when you legalize is in the 18 to 25 demographic, college age and just entering the workforce. And this is not an accident again, and this is something that the industry is very aware of, because when you look at the breakdown of who's using marijuana in this country, the vast majority are actually young people. And what this graph means, if you're in the business of selling marijuana, is that you're going to lose 50% of your profit. People are going to age out of your product. And so if you're trying to get as much money as you can and maximize the amount of people who progress through this pipeline, as well as get the most out of those early years, you want as many young people smoking pot, vaping pot, eating edibles as you possibly can. And this is not a new thing. We saw this with the master settlement agreement from the tobacco industry, where they were very clear in internal documents that today's teenager is tomorrow's potential regular customer. And the ability to track new smokers and develop them is key in terms of creating a young adult franchise. Altria, the people who own Marlboro, have invested in marijuana because there's a lot of cross-pollination in this as well. So the same thing in Camel, where 14 to 18-year-olds are critical and we must establish a new brand. We know that if people are nonconformist and cool, that's really important to young people. That's why Joe Camel exists. So then the question is, of course, like, well, what's the big deal? Right? There's lots of products that are marketed to young people. Why should we care? And the answer, of course, is that it's hurting kids. It actually hurts them in a lot of different ways. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next part of this presentation. But to kick things off, I want to talk about an argument that I hear a lot, which is well, so they're smoking pot. Well, at least it's not as bad as cocaine, or at least it's not as bad as alcohol. And you see these sorts of messages out there. And this is always very confusing to me, because what I like to call this is the two wrongs don't make a right argument. Like, is saying that, like, well, just because something is worse, that doesn't mean that you should do another bad thing. It's actually still bad for you. Like, if you set the bar low enough, anything comes over that, right? Like, you could literally eat a part of your shoe, and that would probably be less harmful to you than heroin. But that doesn't mean that, like, as a parent, you should be like, oh yeah, they're nibbling on sneakers, but at least they're not injecting heroin. Like, how does that make sense, right? Like, it doesn't actually. Yeah, this is, again, just a trope that we're hearing a lot, even though actually two wrongs do not make a right. Just because something isn't as bad doesn't mean that you have to do it. In fact, as we saw earlier, here in the Illinois suburbs, 86% of kids make a different choice. Now, why parents should care, as I mentioned, is that for cannabis for kids, marijuana for kids, it's a particularly bad idea. And I want to talk about specifically why. The first is that there is increased risk for addiction with young people. And yes, that says increased risk, not it can be addictive. It is absolutely addictive. And this is another one of these myths and that gets talked about all the time by people generally who are trying to either justify their own behavior or score political points or make money off of it. But the bottom line is that we've known that marijuana has been physiologically addictive for a really long time. There's back since 2004, when the first major review article came out about this. It's literally in our DSM. I just took a picture of mine. That's like the psychiatric Bible. What we know from research is about 1 in 10 adults and 1 in 6 young people who regularly uses marijuana products is going to become addicted to it. Statistically, that's what it looks like. And it's important to note that, like, that's not everybody. And I think that's part of where people get confused about this. It's not everybody. Just like most people who use alcohol aren't addicted to alcohol, but that does not mean that alcohol is not addictive. And again, it's from an addiction practitioner's perspective, it is very odd that it seems like, everybody knows what's up with alcohol, but for whatever reason, that the same cannot be said for marijuana and cannabis products. But that is the case. Zero debate about this, actually. It's an addictive drug. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, actually, the rate of kids getting addicted is higher than adults. And part of that is because your brain is not done developing. Over time, your brain tends to develop back to front. And so what that means is that the parts of your brain that develop last, or this part that's blue all the way through this diagram over time, your prefrontal cortex, the part in the front of your brain that's associated with things like it's where your personality is, but also where your executive function is housed. And that's where that gives you the ability to do things like plan ahead, think abstractly, synthesize big ideas, stuff that's really important for functioning in life and excelling, but also for avoiding addiction, because addiction is kind of tricky in that a lot of addictive substances feel good at first. They feel good when you use them, and the problems with them require a longer term outlook, or there's something that can be explained away, like, oh, you just don't understand, or oh, you're out of touch, or oh, this isn't the reason why I'm struggling at school, it's this other thing. It's not the sort of thing like with a hot stove where you touch the hot stove and you get burned, and then you learn, oh, I shouldn't touch the stove. It's something where you might even touch the stove and it feels kind of good, but then you feel burned the next day, and it's harder for you to make that connection. And that's why for kids in particular, it's very easy for them to fall into that. Their brain is also wired in such a way, and this goes for a number of different addictive chemicals, where they tend to feel the positive impacts of drugs and alcohol more, and feel the negative impacts like hangovers, that sort of thing, less. So they get more of the positive and less of the negative. Their brains are primed to fall into this trap. So in particular for kids, this is worse. We also, as I mentioned before, vaping plus these concentrates equals big problems, because again, we've got these incredibly potent products that do the most damage in this very trendy right now delivery system. And it's a perfect storm that's causing a lot of problems that we're only going to see increase over time. Use is also associated with negative outcomes at school and at work. And this is for a number of reasons. But in high school, we see things like lower grades, higher dropout rates, increased school disciplinary problems, for, as I mentioned, a number of reasons. One is that it can have to do with social functional issues. So if you are a kid who is choosing to get high for fun, generally with your friends, those are probably not the same kids who are staying out late studying for the test because they really want to get a good grade, right? Like if you're getting high for fun, particularly on a frequent basis, you're probably not the high achievers on Scholastic Bowl or Debate Club. And so that means that you've self-selected yourself into a group of people who are not performing at the highest level and who are not going to push you to do that as well, or where you're going to want to rise to that level. And that has an impact on overall how you do in school. The cognitive side has to do with the brain itself, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, or it could be a combination of both. We also know that the earlier that kids start to use these products, the worse these outcomes tend to be, and that the more frequently they use the products, the worse the outcome tends to be. College, we see a lot of the same stuff: an increased chance to skip class, lower GPA, potentially longer time to graduate. And all of this translates to decreased lifetime earning potential. When you look at the data that we collect from folks around this issue, the more they endorse having used marijuana products across their life, the less money they say that they made across their life, which again just has to do with overall trajectories. Lots of little decisions over time can turn into big decisions. Like, as I alluded to before, if you've got a kid who's choosing to get high for fun all the time instead of study, maybe their GPA is a grade lower or half a grade lower. And maybe that means that the scholarships that they get at different schools are less or not at all. And so maybe they choose a different school where they get a higher scholarship, where they could have otherwise gotten into a better one. There are these breakpoints where, at a certain point, your decisions catch up to you, and it actually does affect the trajectory of your life. It's that sort of thing. It's nothing that's so dramatic where all of a sudden, like the bottom drops out of your IQ. And we'll talk more about cognitive impacts in a minute, but it's subtle and over time. Most cases aren't severe, but they are impactful. So I've mentioned the brain a lot. Let's talk about the brain. What we know about the brain and THC is that it negatively impacts how it develops. Your brain is growing in certain places and pruning in others until it's done cooking, until you're like 25 to 28, somewhere in that vicinity. And whenever you introduce any chemical into that process that's not supposed to be there, which again is any chemical that's you put in there, your brain is meant to develop on its own. I guess maybe you could give it some omega-3, that sort of thing. But other than that, nothing's supposed to be in there. It actually affects that trajectory. This isn't just for THC products, but it is very much true for THC products. So there is a lot of information we could talk about with this. We have a lot of data these days in terms of actual brain scans where we show that the physical shape of the brain changes when you introduce THC into the mix. But I like this study because it's a meta-analysis, it pulls in a lot of other ones, and it covers a lot of ground. So what we're looking at here, and I'll magnify it in a second, is a bunch of studies. Again, this is an aggregated graph showing different brain parts and whether or not introducing THC in literally changes the structure of the brain over time. And so this top row that you're looking there on the right, which I'm going to magnify here on the left, is looking at the dosage that you're putting into your brain. So how strong, how much THC you're taking in, and what effect that has on the structures of the brain. Remember, today's joints are 7 times as strong as they used to be, and concentrates are literally up to 30 to 33 times as much as what people were smoking at Woodstock. So what these little lines are is a percentage breakdown. The gray part of the line means that the studies didn't look at that brain structure. The blue is they did look at the brain structure, didn't find brain damage. But the red means that they looked at that study, they looked at that brain structure and found a structural change due to the dosage of THC that was being put in. And so the two I want to highlight in particular is the second here from the left. HIPP stands for hippocampus. That is the part of your brain that's associated with learning and memory. 85% of studies found structural changes by dosage. And if you go over 3, the PFC, that's that prefrontal cortex that we were talking about earlier that houses the personality and executive function. That was 45% of studies found a physical change in the brain by dosage. Now we're looking at duration. So how long someone used THC, doesn't even matter the dosage. Similar findings in terms of those two brain sections, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, although less consistent. The hippocampus about 1/3 of the time, and the prefrontal cortex about 15% of the time. But in those studies, this means it doesn't even matter how strong of a product you're using. It's just, did you use it for a long time? And if the answer was yes, there's a chance that you've changed the physical structure of your brain. And again, even if we go back to the dosage one, where we see these much higher percentage in certain parts, that everything today is so high potency. It's really alarming. We will not go into all the nitty-gritty details of this, but this is a study, it just came out last year on synaptic reprogramming in the developing brain. So getting even beyond the structure, but saying, how do our neurons communicate with each other? And what's changing. So this, what you're looking at here, is the normal synapse and what's going on there. And I'm going to change the slide, and you can see just visually, there's a lot of differences. I'm going to flash back and forth. You know, there's more, if you look at these proteins here, there's a bunch more of them. There's fewer in other places. Again, we will not go into the nitty-gritty of what's happening, but you know, the up arrows are there, the down arrows are there. Things change that should not change based on when you inject cannabis into this system. And you know, for the purposes of what we're talking about today, that's as far as we'll go. But at the structural level and at the synaptic level, the chemical level, this changes what's going on in the brain. And it should make sense then that it changes how the brain is used. So this is a study, again, we could look at a lot of studies that look at this. There was just one that came out about a month ago, I think, as well, that showed persistent decreases in brain function for a very significant period of time, potentially indefinitely in several different areas of cognitive function. But what this one is looking at is over time in 4 different areas. In the top left, that's short-term memory or working memory. Top right is nonverbal reasoning. Bottom left there is long-term memory. And then bottom right there is inhibitory control, or the ability to control your actions. On those graphs, the blue line is the no marijuana condition, and the red line is the most marijuana condition. And you can see that on each graph, the blue and the red are on opposite sides of the midpoint. And on each of those graphs, wherever the blue is the better score. So yes, there's a change. Does it mean that all of a sudden, if you're using marijuana, you're going to just flunk out of school? Not necessarily, maybe. I mean, that certainly can happen. But again, a lot of it is subtle and progressive over time. That's, again, also how alcohol works, where it's progressive over time and things get worse and worse and worse and more entrenched. And so not going down this path overall, much better in terms of how well your child is going to do in school. Of course, when you are intoxicated, your judgment gets impaired and it can lead to increased risky sexual behavior. And then it can also, and this is more specific to cannabinoids, to marijuana, can cause psychotic breaks. And this increases with a higher percentage of THC. And this is a subject that we could talk about a lot, and is one that oftentimes gets pushed back from the marijuana industry or marijuana evangelists being like, oh, like it's just reefer madness and moral panic and let's go back and all that sort of stuff. And maybe it was back in like the 50s, but it's not anymore. What we're talking about these days are peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, medical journal articles that show over and over and over again that using THC products incites psychosis. It creates psychosis, and not just in people where it would happen anyway. There's been more and more studies that are looking specifically at that. This one actually is one of them. This one came out in 2019. It made national news. It's published in Lancet Psychiatry, very reputable journal, looking at the impact of THC products on first episode psychosis all across Europe. And what they found was that, that if you use today's high potency flower products, marijuana bud products, your risk of having a psychotic break goes up by 50%. And if you're using the concentrates, those really high potency products, that risk goes up by 500%, by 5 times. And there's a lot more in the study if you're interested in looking at it, but really striking numbers. Another study actually that came out just a week later highlighted another element that's very concerning. Emergency department visits tripled in Colorado after they legalized it there. One reason for that was these psychotic breaks. The other one was cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS for short, which is a condition you get. It's basically what a THC overdose looks like. And when it happens, you start vomiting uncontrollably for a really long time. And you also tend to have really severe abdominal pain, like bunches of pain. And what that leads to is a word that is only associated with CHS called scromiting, which means screaming and vomiting at the same time. And if you Google scromiting, you will come up with only cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome articles and news articles. But it's a wildly unpleasant problem, and it's something that can kill you. That's another myth you hear a lot. Marijuana never killed anybody. Absolutely, it kills people. You can literally vomit yourself to death, like this 17-year-old from Indianapolis, 2019. You can get high and drive a car and crash it and die. You can have a psychotic break and commit suicide. There's so many ways to do it. Just because it doesn't cause respiratory arrest doesn't mean that it can't kill you. But that's, again, one of these narratives that gets pushed out a lot. Now, on the mental health side of things, there's been quite a bit of research looking at how marijuana relates to mental health functioning. And so I wanted to grab a couple that were aimed more towards youth. This one was looking at adolescents and also young adults. And what I want us to look at, just because this is where you see the greatest contrast, is this is a study that came out last year, I believe, looking at how mental health is affected and functioning is affected by marijuana. And this is in the frequent to no use column. And this column here with P, this is statistics speak for, is it statistically significant? Is this a real effect? And the lower the number is, the more impactful it is. And anything under 0.05 is significant. So you can see here that psychosis syndromes is that top line, that symptoms rather, that was significant, that's under 0.05. Problematic substance use of other substances is incredibly significant. So the chances that you're going to be using other drugs is very high. And then if you skip down to delinquency, extremely significant. Debt, very significant. General well-being is significantly lower. Feeling socially excluded is significantly higher, so you feel more socially excluded. And the chances that you're not employed or in school is also much, much, much higher between frequent marijuana use category and no marijuana use category. This was a study, came out also very recently within the last 2 years. It was looking at the the relationship between cannabis use and depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And what they found was that the one in particular, what was statistically significant was suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. Pardon me. So it was directly related to suicide attempts in those who were depressed. And this was actually something else that was found in another recent study, that it's a comorbidity risk marker for self-harm, all-cause mortality, and death by unintentional overdose and homicide amongst youth with mood disorders. So specifically, if you've got a young person who is having a mood disorder, if you've got one who is depressed, you add THC on top of that, it actually only makes it worse and potentially, again, really lowers that floor in terms of how bad it can get. Another big issue with kids right now in marijuana products is drugged driving, where kids think that it's safe to drive. It is not safe to drive high. Right now, the statistics show that kids are 4 times more likely to drive high than to drive drunk. So they get the message about drunk driving, but not high driving yet. But this is a major problem. In part because people are very poor estimators of how high they are and what that means in terms of their performance. The way THC works in the body is very different than alcohol. Alcohol sits around in your blood for a while, and the level of blood alcohol matters in terms of impairment. THC works completely differently. It's a very lipophilic substance. It's attracted to fat, and your brain is 70% fat. It's like a big blob of fat. And so THC shoots right out of your blood and into your brain really quickly, where it still affects you but can't be detected. And so what you're looking at in this graph, the pink line is THC in the blood over time. And then you can see that it leaves very quickly within 3 to 4 hours for the most part. But if you look at the blue line, that's the subjective high. That goes down slowly over time, but it is not at 0 when the blood THC is at 0. And the green line is the driving performance line. And you can see there that the slope of that line going up is not the same as the slope of the subjective high going down. And people tend to be impaired a lot longer than they think they are. And this only compounds with edibles, which is what this graph is highlighting. The blue and green lines are for smoking and vaping. The black line is for oral, so if you're eating it. And if you're taking in an edible, it actually takes 3 or so hours to even fully hit you, which means that if you are taking edibles with concentrations that you don't know, you have no idea what's going to happen. You might be more high on the road than when you started. People can take more than one edible if they don't know how it works and overdose that way by accident, take way too much and end up in the emergency room. You also don't have an ability to stop when you eat an edible. Like with a joint, you can just stop smoking when you feel done. And again, because it hits your blood so quickly, you know how you feel quickly as well. With an edible, it's going in unless you induce vomiting, which you're probably not going to do. So there's a lot of issues around THC and driving. And right now, this is one of the biggest gaps for young people. They don't understand that it's dangerous. The last controversy I really want to touch on right now that is not actually a controversy has to do with marijuana being a gateway drug. And yes, marijuana is a gateway drug. And I want to explain why, and then also why I think there's some confusion about this. But first, let's start with the numbers. If a young person is using marijuana, their chances of using an illicit drug other than marijuana is literally 10 times higher. This is a longitudinal study looking at the chances of developing a new prescription pill opioid addiction if you are using recreational marijuana. And you can see the odds ratio from 0.5 to 3 here. This is 5 times higher for occasional use, and frequent and very frequent use is 8 times as high. This was a 2017 study. This one was from last year. It was specifically looking at a young adult urban cohort of color. And if you look at, this is again, the chances of developing a new opioid addiction if you were using marijuana earlier. And you can see here that here's the low and non-user cluster and the chances. And then if you go left, here's the young adult onset, creeping up a bit. Adolescent though, limited onset, look at how much higher those bars are. Almost twice as likely that they're going to develop this problem. 7 times as likely that they're going to use, 4.5 rather, times as likely that they're going to use heroin. And then chronic onset, there on the far left, of marijuana use, the chances is so much higher. And part of this, the reason why this is the case is that no one starts their drug journey with heroin. No one starts with fentanyl overdosing. 92% of people who use heroin at some point before then used marijuana at some point. And the reason for that is that the perceived risk of heroin, of fentanyl, of methamphetamine, of all of these really intense drugs is really high. It's seen as really risky. If a friend walks up to a teenager who's never used a drug before in their life and they're like, hey, do you want to tie off and inject some heroin with me? That kid would be like, hard pass, like there's no way they say yes to that. That's not how that's nowhere in the realm of possibility for them. No one starts that way. However, if a friend walks up and says, hey, you want to take a hit off this vape? I've got a weed vape. They might be thinking something like, well, like, isn't it medicine anyway, and it's legal, so it must be fine, and everybody's doing it, all these myths that are put out there to lower perceived risk. And then they do it. And then at that point, once they're doing that, they've crossed a couple boundaries. The first is now they are someone who gets high for fun. This is part of their identity now. This is something that they're doing. And they're also someone who's given themselves a permission structure to break the law to have fun, or to break the law if they want to. And so once you've broken the seal on that, and you see yourself as like, I'm someone who gets high for fun, breaks the law when I see fit, then if you're at a party, because if your friends are getting high, you're much more likely to come in contact with a bar of Xanax or a line of cocaine or some Percocet. And then you're much more likely to take it, because that's a lot closer to the realm of your possibility than it was before. And then maybe you get hooked on Percocet because that grabs you a lot more quickly than THC does. And then eventually people tend to switch to heroin because it's cheaper, because it's less safe. And that's where you start hearing a lot more about this fentanyl contamination and the overdoses. But that's like step 4, right? The fentanyl and meth and all that, that's like step 4. You don't get to step 4 until you first take step 1 and step 2 and step 3. If you don't take step 1, you're not going to get to step 4. If you take step 1, you open up a gateway to progress. And that's what gateway means. And I think that and all the statistics support, this is the mechanism where it comes from, all the statistics support this. I think where the confusion comes in is people confuse risk with determinism. Just because you use marijuana doesn't mean that you're going to use heroin. That's not what this graph that's on your screen right now says. It just says that if you're going to get to heroin, you're probably going to start with marijuana at some point in your past. And that's a very different thing. And I think that it's very easy to get caught in those details. But you ask anybody who's working in drug treatment, who's in the addiction services industry, we've heard this story a million times. It's just simply how it works. So last couple points on this before we pivot over to parenting strategies. It absolutely does matter what we message out to our youth. This is the model of addiction development from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA. And the way this develops is a combination between biology and genes there on the left, the environment, then the drug enters, goes through brain mechanisms, which eventually leads to addiction when you do it repetitively. We can't affect the biology and genes, but the environment, the availability matters. And I talk about this a lot when people ask me to speak on legalization and commercialization as a whole, but then also local dispensary impact. This is something, this is a topic that I also speak on a lot, that there's more and more data coming out that shows within 4 miles of a dispensary, you get a lot of negative impacts, particularly on young adult and adolescent use because of the availability. So it's easier to get. And then also the peer influences and community attitudes, again, that are communicated down to kids, which is why when you see things, this was from a few years back, but news correspondents on party buses in Colorado using gas mask bongs, or more like in our backyard where dispensaries are handing out their swag to kids at Buffalo Grove days, and when given an opportunity to apologize, they don't. Or when a dispensary against Illinois law uses a raccoon to advertise, even though we're not allowed to use animals, dispensaries rather are not allowed to use animals to advertise. And this particular dispensary happens to be literally like under 5 minutes away from Ravinia Elementary School, who uses a raccoon as a mascot. And other companies that are literally encouraging you to smoke every day, that eventually this gets down to kids. And this is all thought out. This is not an accident. This is part of a business plan that all you have to do is look for it. It's all over the internet. There's a lot behind a paywall because people oftentimes don't give these secrets away, these business secrets away for free, but they are trying to, shredding the stoner stereotype, associate it with wellness, make marijuana become more normal, make it mainstream. This is a whole industry with social media influencers, professionals. This is a commercial for-profit business in the addiction sector. And that means that you get the most money from young people using your product and from people being addicted to your product. And that's why there's no surprise that in the most recent Monitoring the Future study, again, because this has been consistent for years, our kids are telling us, 1 in 4 12th graders say, if you legalize marijuana in our state, we're either going to try it for the first time or we're going to use more. And that is the reality here in Illinois right now that we are living. And part of why it's so important that we are as proactive as possible with our kids rather than being reactive. And so that brings us to the last component of what can we do about this, which ultimately, again, from that doing rather than just knowing standpoint is really important for parents to know. So specifically, things that you can do. The number one thing is to stay connected to your child and then know the signs of there potentially being a problem. Now, staying connected is a lot harder than it sounds. I know, it's not something that you might want to be connected, but you might not be cool enough. There might be really entrenched behavioral patterns in your family that make it hard. But knowing what's going on in your kid's life is really important, because if you don't know what normal is, you're not going to know when normal changes. If you don't have that anchor point, you're not going to know when it drifts. So knowing what normal is for your child is really important. Now, signs of adolescent substance use, they can be in a number of different categories. I'm going to put a few in front of you now. The first is at school. A lot of times if a young person is using, you're going to see truancy or missed appointments and homework, engaging in fewer extracurriculars. As far as friends go, old friends might fade away, particularly if those old friends are making healthier choices that aren't related to substances. And your child might have new friends, but it's like you've never met them. It's like they're trying to keep them away from you, likely because you wouldn't be happy about what you saw. You'd be worried about it. On their social media, a lot of times there's bunches of information about teenage drug use just hanging out literally in plain sight if you look. And this could be a whole presentation about making sure that you're monitoring your kids on their devices. It is not actually a safe place for them. The majority of drug deals right now for kids go down on Snapchat and on Instagram. And so making sure that you're aware of what's going on, you know what to look for. I think on my social media feeds, I recently published a DEA handout that I actually didn't know existed until I came across it about a month ago. But there's a handout that the DEA made of the common emojis that are used to represent different drugs. So definitely worth familiarizing yourself with that to know what to look for. But make sure you're on your kids' devices. It's so important. In the home, you might notice that relationships are getting strained, that they're avoiding you, that they're moody, that they're not abiding by curfew. But with all of this, it's important to recognize that no one sign or even a combination is hard proof of a substance use issue. There's a lot of reasons why these things could happen. But a lot of times, if you're seeing this really diffuse web of issues and changes, that's the reason why. And a big part of that's because using substances takes a lot of time. And, from obtaining it, using it, recovering from it, hiding it. And if your child, particularly if they're scheduled, or if they have a track record of achievement, you're going to notice some changes because that time has to come from somewhere. And that also means time is being subtracted from other things. So again, if you know what to look for, the signs are going to be there. Now, specifically in their personal appearance and their habits, things to look for, just a general decline in hygiene. They get burns on their fingers or lips. If they have dilated or red eyes, both actually can be a sign of THC use. A lot of times people think of pupil dilation or constriction with opioids, but actually for the concentrates in particular, what the kids are vaping these days, because the THC concentration is so high, it actually can cause eye dilation in a lot of cases. Is the wardrobe for your child changing? Does it look like they're trying to subscribe to a different subculture, maybe one that's more associated with drug use than before? Do they have either too much or too little money? A lot of kids serve as kind of like small-time drug dealers in schools, serve as middlemen. And so if it seems like your child either has too much money or items that you didn't buy for them, or if their money is disappearing, definitely a sign to watch out for. Are they making secretive phone calls? Does it seem like their sleep is changing, or their habits, sleep habits and energy? Are they having the munchies or sudden appetite? Does it seem like they're trying to mask scents in some way, like they're using bunches of perfume, gum, mouthwash? All of these, again, not necessarily the case that they're using, but some of them are more cut and dry. So as I mentioned before, multiple areas are usually impacted when there's a substance use disorder. It takes considerable time and effort. If you know what normal looks like, you can know when it changes. And that's really the biggest take home from these first few slides. You got to have that anchor point and then know what to look for. So next, communicating effectively as well as possible, really helpful. A lot of folks, you talk with your kids and it works great. And if that's the case, maybe none of this applies to you that I'm about to talk about in this slide, but if you feel like there's disconnects, sometimes your approach might be the problem rather than your son or daughter is just impenetrable. And an acronym that I really like, that I didn't make up, is communicate with love. And that love stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So on the listening front, what this means is ask open-ended questions and reflect things back to your child. Listen actively. A lot of times we take for granted that people know that we care, that we're listening, but we actually have to show it. And you can do that by asking questions that allow your child to elaborate more. These are questions that start with stems like who, or not who, like what or how, sometimes why, although why sometimes comes across, people can be defensive with that, like why do you feel that way? But just so that they don't have to answer with just yes or no, right? Really give them an opportunity to speak. And then reflections means that you're taking the information in and then reflecting it back, ideally in different words, or really digging into a feeling that you're hearing behind the words. So if you've got your child talking to you about how they're really struggling with geometry at school, you could say, oh man, that sounds so frustrating, or that must really hurt to try so hard and not get the grade that you wanted. And saying something like that, if they didn't explicitly say that to you, shows you're listening, because you took it in, you processed it, and you gave it back to them in a slightly different form. That also tends to help a young person, or anyone really, go deeper. These, by the way, are tricks that we use as therapists all the time, hashtag therapist tricks. This also, if you're familiar with motivational interviewing as a theory, these are all right in line with that. But the O stands for offering. So how do you offer guidance and advice? What I suggest you try is what's called a feedback sandwich. And what this is about is that if someone feels ownership over information, they're much more likely to use the guidance than if they feel like it's being put on them. So the feedback sandwich means you put the feedback, as the meat of the sandwich or the guidance, in between two slices of bread. And the first slice of bread is asking permission. So literally ask, do you mind if I share some thoughts about that? Or are you open to suggestions? Or, like I've been through something similar, can I share it with you? Asking permission means that the person on the other side is literally asking for the guidance, asking for the advice. And so it means you're not pushing it on them. When you push, someone can push back. If you don't push, they can't push back. Doesn't mean they're going to take it, of course, but it takes you right out of that pushing dynamic, that push back, attack, counterattack sort of thing. So ask permission, then provide the information, and then follow that up by asking for reactions. You can even say, it's okay to disagree. What do you think about this? That when a child in particular is told you can form your own opinion about this, it's very empowering. It means they're much more likely to actually take that advice. The V stands for validating. That means let someone know their feelings are okay. Never in the history of the world has someone been having a hard time. And like, just think about this in your own life. Like if you're having a hard time and say like your partner or your spouse is like, stop overreacting, you're too emotional. Are you ever like, my gosh, you're right. My feelings were just totally blown out of proportion. I shouldn't feel my feelings. That was wrong. Share more. No, right? That never happens, never. And the same thing works for kids. Even if as adults, sometimes we know that they're taking it out of proportion. I remember like 6 months ago, my son, 4 years old at the time, my daughter sat in his place at the table, and it was like an absolute apocalypse. And, it's very easy to look at that as, like it's a spot at the table, get over it. But for him, it was really meaningful. That's why he was crying his eyes out, right? And so really reinforcing like, it's okay for this to be meaningful, let's talk about it. That allows a young person and also adults, to be honest with you, to acknowledge their feelings and then eventually move past them. And the E stands for empathizing. To borrow a term from Brene Brown, be in a hole with somebody. A lot of times you just swoop in, trying to save someone from whatever situation they're in. A lot of times people want to be heard and validated and empathized with before you swoop in and save them. So take a second, be in the hole with them, stick it out, and then move forward. All that said, if this doesn't initially work, if you don't have the best relationship with your child, don't get discouraged. Keep trying. If you haven't established previously that you've got this really firm connection and that you're emotionally safe, which is ultimately what all of this is about, is communicating to your child, I'm an emotionally safe person, which is really important, because if you don't come across that way, they're not going to share things with you that they're uncomfortable with or not proud of. Doesn't mean you can't set boundaries, but being emotionally safe is really important. It might take some time to build it. So I want to acknowledge it is 8:30 right now. I've got maybe about like 3 minutes left of content, and then I'm happy to stay a little bit late, take some questions. But for those who are on a tighter timeline, I just want to let you know we are coming up towards the end. So next, provide pro-social activities and peer groups for your children to identify with. This is really important. If you think back to that NIDA model, those peer influences, the friends they're around, hugely impactful on what choices they make. So making sure that you give them those healthy people and places to go to, really critical in terms of getting them down a good path. This next bullet is tricky if you haven't been doing it, but also really important, and that's to reward positive behavior rather than just punishing poor behavior. And what I mean by this is that boundaries, really important. Like 100%, you have to set them sometimes. But a lot of times parents get into this rhythm of like, if your child is behaving, then like that's like a C grade, and then punish when something goes wrong. And particularly if a child is acting out, it's very easy to just punish, but then the behavior isn't changing. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have punishments, you shouldn't have negative consequences. However, what we know from a lot of research and over a lot of different contexts is that positive reinforcement is actually a stronger predictor of repeated behavior than adding punishments. So what that means is if you want your child to behave differently, you can't just punish negative behavior, you have to reward the behaviors you want them to repeat. And that's something that I think a lot of parents skip over. They don't incentivize good behavior, they just try to disincentivize bad behavior. And what this next bullet is getting at, that behaviors serve a purpose, is that if your child is doing something like, say, using marijuana products, despite punishments, that means they're getting something out of that that's more important to them than your punishments. And that could be very tempting then to just say, well, I'm just going to step up the punishments. But what that's ignoring is that they're getting something important from that behavior. And you need to understand what that is, whether or not it's social acceptance, dealing with depression, anxiety, whatever it is, you've got to understand what that is in order to give them a better offer. Like, hey, we can meet these needs without you turning to drugs. That's possible, and it's really important to actually make for long-term behavioral change. As I mentioned before, And lastly, have access to phones and mobile devices. There's so much that goes on in there in the realm of THC, marijuana products. If you're not on there, consider doing it immediately. They really don't get privacy when you're paying for their phone and paying for their plan, and you are their guardian. The internet is not a particularly safe place for kids right now, just to put it bluntly. So to sum everything up, misperceptions about cannabis and marijuana abound, and this isn't an accident. There are billion-dollar industries that are in companies that are trying to make money at the expense of our adolescents and young adults. And all the messaging that's put out, the lack of regard for marketing laws, all of that, that's on purpose. It's not an accident. These products can be vaped, and that again is this perfect storm of a delivery system and a product that has the greatest consequences. It's far from a benign substance, and it's particularly harmful for teens and young adults. We talked about a lot of those impacts today, but again, this is one of these biggest, most amazing flip jobs where kids are thinking that it's less and less harmful when it's actually getting more and more harmful over time. It's counterproductive. It lowers these messages. It lowers the perceptions of perceived risk. And stay connected, communicate effectively, parent consistently, create a healthy social ecosystem. It's critical to getting your child to the best outcome possible and helping them make these decisions on their own, because ultimately that's what they're going to be doing when they're at school and with their friends, and when they go to college, that's what they're going to be doing when you're not there to try to impose this structure. So thank you guys so much for your time and attention, and for sticking with me as we ran over by a couple minutes tonight. Again, if you'd like to get in touch, there's my email. Feel free to come visit my website, learn a little bit more about my work, or connect with me on social media. I'd love to talk with you more there. So with that, I'll pitch it back over, I think, to Lauren, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. That was amazing. I really like how you made it practical for parents, and I love the LOVE acronym, especially during this Valentine's Day season. So that was really, really wonderful. Feel free, we're getting some comments just about the presentation being great. Feel free if you have any questions to put them in the Q&A chat. At this time, we don't have any. We do have an event survey though. In the meantime, oh, we got some questions. All right. How can you encourage healthy and positive social relationships without getting overly involved and or judging their friends?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I don't know if there's a one size fits all answer. I think that, so ultimately, what's used, sometimes as a guardian, you do have to step in if you feel like your child is doing something that's dangerous, or if they're hanging out with people that's actively harming their health, they're doing illegal things. Sometimes that's unavoidable, but it's also your job as their guardian. But when it's something that's a little bit less cut and dry like that, I think the first step is presenting them with opportunities to make new friends and get involved in things where that's not, no pun intended, baked into that social ecosystem, where they can get involved and they can make friends in healthy pro-social places. That's the first one. Another, and this is the ideal time to do this also is younger, because when I was talking about the gateway effect, and that a lot of kids are going to say no to heroin, say no to meth, because they're like, that's not me. Right? I'm not someone who breaks the law. I'm not someone who gets high for fun. I'm not someone who experiments with drugs. What that relates back to is a personal identity. And so if you can form a personal identity around not breaking the law, around having fun in healthy and legal ways, and this also is what you modeled your kids with drugs and alcohol in the home, with marijuana and with alcohol products in the home, but having them craft an identity also where they value their brain, they value their grades, they value their health. That character level aspect has its fingers in all sorts of decisions they're going to make in their life. And I think that ultimately, like when some teens make their way to me, or when parents make their way to me about their teens, and I hear about how all their friends are vaping and they're caught up in all this in this subculture, this fight they've been having for years. I mean, there's basically no way to extract them from that, because that's their identity as a person right now. Like you have to actually take them out of that entirely. That's part of what some specialty treatment programs, residential, wilderness programs, even therapeutic boarding schools sometimes are there for, because you stick the child back in that environment with those people, and that's their identity. Of course they're going to vape. Of course they're going to get high. That's who they are. Right. And so it's really just this question of where they are in that process, and hopefully helping them foster an identity where getting high for fun is not who they are. That makes the decision for them. So hopefully that helps. I feel like it was a little bit of a roundabout answer, but it's a really, really complicated question.
Yeah, it is. Kind of stemming on that, if a parent knows that their child is taking drugs, like what would you recommend just initial steps to be in hopes of getting them to stop eventually?
So the first thing that you'd want to do is, as I mentioned, find out why, and see if you can have an honest conversation with them about it, and try to figure that out, because ultimately they're trying to meet a need. And that's another aspect of it where, as a parent, of course, you're going to have to set boundaries. There are going to be consequences to keep them safe. And it's important that they know that. But if you're taking away whatever reason they're using it for, like if that's their coping strategy for anxiety, or if that's the only peer group that they feel they're a part of, you've got to give them a better offer, right, in order to be able to actually sustainably keep them away from that. So I think the first step is finding out why, and also about whether or not at this point they're willing to make a change. Because if you've got a child who's a willing participant, it's a completely different ballgame than if you're having to try to like drag them into it kicking and screaming, or set up really harsh boundaries, or send them to more intense treatment programs, because you're really looking more at like their an identity change rather than just something they're doing for fun. So that's the first step. Feel free to enlist a professional for that. Like I'm an addiction psychologist. I do this for adults and adolescents all the time. But just in terms of trying to figure out, okay, where are you with all of this, and what would give you the best chance at success moving forward?
Thank you. And then probably our last question for the night, Sarah asks, how would you suggest redirecting a child from friends that are doing drugs?
Oh man, again, it's kind of like that previous question. It's hard to be prescriptive without knowing the specific situation, but I would, depending on what lands, right, try to figure out what the child values about either those friends or about the situation, or if they have reservations about their use, like if they're feeling kind of like I know this isn't good for me, but I feel like I have to do it, or I'm going to be on the outside looking in of this friend group. You just try to find if there's any area in which you and your child overlap, some like shared goal or shared value. Start with that and see whether or not you can elicit some behavioral change with that. But again, ultimately, if you know that when your child hangs out with a group of people, they're hurting themselves and they're doing things that are illegal with them, at a certain point as a parent, you have to make some tougher choices. But how you go about that, how you do that, how you present it, what you present to them instead, again, not just the punishment and the boundaries, but also incentivizing other things. So they see, oh, working with you guys, working with you, my parents, isn't just like a drag. You're not just trying to rain on my parade or take away the people I care about, but you're trying to help me in this way isn't actually so bad after all. Like that's kind of the transition you're trying to make. But again, I know it can be really tough to do that. How you do that, I think, really varies from person to person and family to family.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. That was amazing. Going to share just a couple ending slides. I know we can't see all of our attendees, but I know you're clapping in your homes for Dr. Weiner. And just for those who are local in our community, we have a couple coalitions dedicated to drug prevention among youth. So Community, the Anti-Drug, serves the communities of Bannockburn, Deerfield, Highland Park, Highwood, and Riverwoods. And Stand Strong Coalition serves Lincolnshire, Long Grove, Prairie View, and portions of Buffalo Grove, Vernon Hills, Mundelein, and Killdeer. And we posted a couple links that have additional resources on this topic for you. We'll also email that out with our follow-up along with the recording of the presentation. And if you're able, we would love your feedback on tonight's program, just so we can continue to improve programs in the future. And so if you are not on your phone, you can take out your phone, take a picture of the QR code, or Catherine put the link in the chat box. We would love your feedback on that. And then just thanks again to our sponsors. It's so great to be in a community, and thank you so much to Dr. Weiner again. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you have a wonderful week and look forward to being with you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again, everyone. Take care. Have a good night.